The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Adeline Marsh found the man. She almost didn't see him. The wind was driving hard from the north, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache even before you stepped outside. And she had bundled herself in every layer she owned just to reach the woodpile. Her breath came out in short white bursts. The trees had gone silent the way they only do in deep January, that particular hush that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. He was half buried in the drift against the fence line, one arm stretched toward the barn, as though he'd been reaching for something and simply run out of time. Adeline stopped. She was 23 years old, alone on 40 acres outside Vermilion, Alberta, and she had enough good sense to know that a strange man in your yard was a reason for caution, not charity. She stood there for a long moment, watching for the rise and fall of his chest. She saw it. Barely, but she saw it. She pulled him inside herself because there was no one else to do it. He was bigger than he looked in the snow, broader through the shoulders, heavier in the way of a man who worked outdoors, and it took her 4 attempts to drag him across the threshold and onto the kitchen floor. She left a trail of red from the doorstep to the hearth. By the time she got the door shut against the wind, her arms were shaking and her back had seized up, and the man on her floor had still not opened his eyes. His name, she would learn eventually, was Harlan Cade. But that first night she called him nothing. That first night he was simply a problem she had chosen, and she set about solving him the way she'd learned to solve everything since her father died, quietly, without asking for help and without expecting anything in return. Adeline had come to the homestead 2 years earlier, after her mother passed in the spring, and there was nothing left in Edmonton but an empty house full of borrowed furniture. Her father, Reuben Marsh, had built the place on land he'd broken with his own hands during a summer that had nearly killed him. He used to say the land had given him everything. He never mentioned what it had taken. He was gone before Adeline turned 20. Her mother lasted another year and then didn't. The homestead was the only thing left with her name on it, so she went. Her nearest neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Okafor, who ran a small egg operation 2 miles down the road, had come by in September with a jar of apple butter and a look of careful concern. "You planning to stay the winter?" she'd asked. Adeline said she was. Mrs. Okafor had nodded slowly, like she was accepting a piece of information she wasn't sure she believed. "Well," she said, "you know where I am." That was about the extent of it. Adeline was not unfriendly, but she had grown up in a household that treated hardship as a private matter, and she carried that habit the way you carry the accent of the place you were raised, without noticing it until someone points it out. She had 40 acres, a milk cow named Bess, a root cellar with enough preserved food to last through February if she was careful, and a woodpile that she'd spent most of October building. She had her father's rifle on a hook above the door and her mother's cast iron pan on the stove. She had a small savings from selling the Edmonton house that she kept in a coffee tin behind a loose board in the pantry. She did not have much room in her budget for an unconscious stranger bleeding on her kitchen floor, but here one was. She cleaned the wound on his side as best she could. It looked like something had gone into him, a branch or a blade. She couldn't say which, and she packed it with clean linen and got him onto the cot she dragged from the back room. His boots were so worn through that she could see the shape of his toes through the leather, and his coat was the kind that had been good once, maybe 10 years ago, and had been repaired so many times that the repairs were now the coat. He had no identification she could find. No papers, no letter, nothing with a name on it. There was a pocket knife, a stub of lead pencil, and a folded piece of brown paper with numbers written on it that she didn't understand. She put everything on the shelf above the cot and went back to her chores. For 3 days he barely moved. He ran a fever that second night that frightened her badly. She sat beside him until 2 in the morning, laying cold cloths on his forehead, listening to him breathe in that wet, unsteady way that made her think of her mother in her last week. She told herself she was staying awake out of practicality. If he died in her house, she'd have to deal with that. And dealing with it alone in January was a thing she'd rather avoid. She was not sure she believed herself. On the fourth morning, he opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, like a man assembling a memory he'd dropped in pieces. Then he turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes were gray-green, the color of the river in late September, and they were, she noticed, very careful eyes, the kind that took in more than they let on. "Where am I?" he said. Not a question, exactly. More like a man checking his own coordinates. "Marsh Homestead," she said, "outside Vermilion. You were in my yard." He was quiet for a moment. "How long? 4 days." Something moved across his face, not surprise, but something adjacent to it. "You did this yourself?" There wasn't anyone else. He looked at her for another moment. "I'm Harlan Cade," he said. "Adeline Marsh." He nodded like he was filing it away carefully. Then he said, "I'm sorry for the trouble," and closed his eyes again. He was not an easy man to read. He recovered slowly but without complaint, which Adeline found she respected. He didn't ask for things. When he was well enough to sit up, he asked if there was anything he could do from the cot. Mending, sharpening, anything with his hands. And when she brought him her father's old harness that had needed repair since August, he worked at it steadily for 2 hours without being asked twice. She fed him from what she had, which was not much. Porridge in the mornings, salt pork and dried beans in the evenings, biscuits when she had the flour for it. She was aware that feeding 2 mouths was pressing her closer to the edge of her calculations. But she didn't say so, and he seemed to understand without being told. "You live out here alone," he said one evening. It wasn't a challenge, just an observation, the way he said most things. "I do. Since when?" "Since my father died, 2 years," she paused. "My mother the spring before that." He said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry." She nodded. She wasn't sure why she'd told him that. She didn't usually. "What about you?" she said, and then almost regretted asking, because she wasn't sure she wanted to know. But he just said, "I've been working trap lines up by the Vermilion River, had a contract with a buyer in Lloydminster for the season." He stopped. Didn't quite make it to Lloydminster. She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. She learned not to push. He was the kind of man who offered information the way you offer something fragile, carefully, a piece at a time, watching to see if you'd handle it right before giving you more. But there were things she noticed. He watched the lane from the window when he thought she wasn't looking. He startled at sounds that didn't startle her. When she came in from the barn one afternoon and the door swung back hard in the wind, she saw his hand go to his side before he caught himself. She filed all of it away and said nothing. He was on his feet by the second week, moving slowly but moving. He asked to help with the wood, and when she pointed out that he hadn't fully healed, he said he was aware of that, and could he help with the wood? She let him. He turned out to be the kind of worker who did things thoroughly and without performance. Just put his head down and did them until they were done. He restacked half the woodpile in a configuration that, she admitted to herself, was more stable than her own. He found a gap in the barn wall she hadn't noticed and patched it with boards from the scrap pile. He fixed the latch on the chicken coop that had been sticking since October. She watched him from the kitchen window and thought, "This man knows how to work. And he is working like someone who owes a debt and is uncomfortable with owing it." She thought she understood that feeling. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the 3rd week of February, when she came in from checking the fence line and found him standing very still in the middle of the kitchen, looking at the lane through the window. She knew, from the set of his shoulders, that something had changed. "There's a truck," he said, "blue, parked at the road." She came to stand beside him. She could see it, the truck engine idling, just sitting there at the end of her lane. It pulled away while she watched, slowly like it had wanted to be seen. "Do you know that truck?" she said. "A beat?" "Yes." She waited. "His name is Vince Barrow," Harlan said. "He runs a crew out of Lloydminster. He contracted me for the season's pelts, and he paid me half up front." He paused. "I found out, about a week before I ended up in your yard, that he's been running stolen equipment through the territory. Farm equipment. He's been clearing out operations up and down the river valley, staging it as fires, accidents." Adeline was very still. "People lost their livelihoods," he said. "A man named Turcotte, up near Heinsberg, lost everything. Couldn't prove it was Barrow." He looked at her. "I had proof, in writing. Ledger entries I copied out the night before I left his camp. He found out I had them." She looked at the road where the truck had been. "And he followed you here?" "I didn't intend." He stopped. "I didn't know how far I'd make it. I was trying to get to a phone. To the RCMP detachment in Vermilion." Adeline was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the coffee tin behind the pantry board. She thought about the woodpile which had taken her all of October to build. She thought about Bess in the barn, and the gap Harlan had patched in the wall, and the way her father used to say the land had given him everything. "Where are those ledger copies now?" she said. He looked at her. "In my coat, lining." She nodded once. "Then we need to get them to Vermilion." It was not as simple as driving to town. The roads had drifted badly in the last storm, and Adeline's truck was old enough that she didn't fully trust it in those conditions. More than that, if Barrow's people were watching the lane, they'd be watching the road into town as well, Mrs. Okafor. Adeline thought of her neighbor with the egg operation, 2 miles down through the back field, accessible by a track that didn't connect to the main road. She explained it to Harlan. He said, "I don't want to pull someone else into this." "She already knows the valley," Adeline said. "And she has a phone that actually works, which mine hasn't since December." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you the plan." He was quiet for a moment. Then he almost smiled, just at the corner, just briefly. "All right," he said. They went after dark, on foot through the field, the snow crunching under their boots and the temperature somewhere around -25. Adeline knew the path well enough to walk it without a light. Harlan stayed close, moving quietly for a big man, and she noticed he was still favoring his left side, but not badly anymore. Mrs. Okafor opened the door before they knocked. She took one look at Adeline's face and said, "Come in then," and did not ask any unnecessary questions. She listened to the situation over tea with the expression of a woman who had heard worse and dealt with worse and was prepared to deal with this. When Harlan finished, she said, "My son-in-law drives the propane truck. He goes through Lloydminster every Thursday. He knows the detachment sergeant there." She looked at Harlan. "Better than local, maybe, if Barrow has connections in Vermilion." Harlan looked at her. "That would—" He stopped, started again. "Yes, that would be better." Mrs. Okafor picked up the phone. What happened next took 2 days, and several phone calls and a drive that Adeline didn't go on. Because someone needed to stay at the homestead, and someone needed to look like nothing had changed. She did not sleep much those 2 days. She fed Bess and collected the eggs and kept the fire going, and did not look at the road more than she could help. On the second morning, she found boot tracks along the fence line that weren't hers or Harlan's. She didn't tell anyone. She just noted them and went back inside and made sure the rifle was where she'd left it. On the third afternoon, a vehicle she didn't recognize came up the lane. She stood in the doorway with her hand near the rifle hook until the door opened and she saw Mrs. Okafor's son-in-law step out, and behind him, a woman in a dark jacket with an RCMP badge on her lanyard. The sergeant's name was Constable Yvette Delorme. She was from the Major Crimes Unit out of Edmonton. She had been, it turned out, looking at Vince Barrow's operation for 14 months. What Harlan had in the lining of his coat gave her what she needed. Barrow was arrested 6 days later, along with 2 members of his crew. The charges covered theft, fraud, and arson across 4 counties. The Turcotte family, Adeline read later in the Lloydminster paper, that Mrs. Okafor brought by, were among the families being considered for restitution from the recovered assets. Harlan stayed through March. He didn't talk about it much. The arrest, what it meant. Any of it. He was not a man who processed things out loud. But Adeline noticed that he'd stopped watching the lane from the window, and that the careful quality in his eyes had relaxed, just slightly, into something that looked more like rest. He helped her mend the fence line that had come down in the February storm. He rebuilt the woodpile to last through April. He found a crack in the root cellar ceiling and patched it before the spring melt could do damage. He asked, one afternoon, if she'd thought about what she was going to do with the place long term. Not in an intrusive way, in the way someone asks when they're trying to understand something and are also maybe asking something else underneath it. She told him she planned to stay, that the land was hers and she intended to keep it. He nodded. You could run a proper trapline on the north quarter, he said. The timber's good. I know a buyer in St. Paul, pays fair, would be steady income through the season. She looked at him. You seem to know a lot about my property. I walked it, he said, while you were checking fence last week. Habit and it's good land, he said. Your father built something that lasts. She didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about her father, who had broken this ground in one hard summer and had called it everything and had never mentioned what it cost him. She thought about what it had cost her to hold on to it. Not the labor, which she didn't mind, but the quiet of it. The specific weight of doing everything alone and having nowhere to put that weight down. He did, she said finally. Harlan left the first week of April, when the roads had cleared and the season was starting. He had a contract in the Peace River country. New territory, different buyer. He stood at the end of the lane, with his patched coat and his worn boots, and he said he would send money for what she'd spent on his recovery. She told him not to bother. He looked at her with those gray-green river eyes, and she thought he might say something about that, argue, or insist. Instead he said, Adeline. Harlan. He reached into his coat and took out the stub of lead pencil she'd set on the shelf above his cot 3 months earlier. He set it on her fence post, with a kind of deliberateness, like he was leaving something he meant to come back for. Then he got in the truck Mrs. Okafor's son-in-law had arranged, and he went north. She didn't expect to hear from him again. She told herself she hadn't expected anything in the first place, which was not entirely honest, but was close enough. He wrote in June, a letter, actual paper, with a Peace River postmark. It was not a long letter. He was not, she had learned, a man who used more words than necessary. But at the end of it, he asked if she'd looked into the trap line on the north quarter, and if she hadn't, he knew someone who could walk her through the permits. She wrote back. He came back through in August, on his way south. He stayed 4 days. He fixed the barn door that had been warping since spring, and she fed him properly for the first time since January. And on the last evening they sat on the step in the August dark, and he told her, for the first time, the real story of how he'd ended up in the Barrow camp in the first place, a misread situation, a needed income, and the particular kind of moral discomfort that grows slowly until you can no longer ignore it. She told him about the boot tracks she'd found along the fence line during those 2 days she'd spent alone, while the documents were making their way to Edmonton. He looked at her. You didn't say anything. There was nothing to be done about it then, she said. I just wanted you to know. He was quiet for a while. The northern sky in August holds the light late, and the tree line to the west was still visible, dark against deep blue. I owe you more than I can settle, he said. She thought about that, about owing and settling, and what it meant to let someone help you without immediately handing the weight back. Her father had never learned that. Her mother hadn't either. She had grown up thinking that was just how things were, that you carried what was yours, and you didn't let it show. You don't owe me anything, she said, but you could come back in the fall. Help me set up that trap line. Show me what you know. He looked at her for a long moment. I could do that, he said. The light faded slowly over the spruce. Bess shifted in the barn behind them. Somewhere down the field, a nighthawk called once, and then was quiet. Adeline Marsh had come to this land because there was nowhere else left to go. And she had stayed because the land was hers, and because staying was the only way she knew to honor what her father had built. She had not planned on any of the rest of it. Not the man in the snow, not the months of careful tending, not the particular way a difficult season can reshape a life while you're too busy to notice it's happening. But she had chosen, the moment she saw that chest rising and falling in the January drift. She had chosen, and it had cost her, flour and firewood and sleep and fear, and it had given her something back that she did not yet have a name for. She sat on the step in the August dark with her father's land around her, and she thought that was probably enough.